Welcome to part 8 of my Planet Defense game series. In this tutorial, we're building a complete game step by step using Phaser 4. You'll find the full playlist linked in the description. We've got the gameplay working, now let's make it feel more complete and fun to play by adding some visual polish and user interface elements. First, let's display our player's current score on our screen. We already increased the score each time an enemy is destroyed, so now we need to create a simple text game object in the top left hand corner and update our text as our score changes. For this change, we'll go into our game scene. First, we'll want to add a property to keep track of our text game object. That way we can modify our text when our score updates. So for this new property, we'll call it score text. Now if we come down to our create method, so now after we initialize our score to 0, let's create our text game object. For our text game object, let's do const. We'll do our score text prefix. For this, we're going to set equal to this.add.text. And now for our position, we're going to do 10 for our x, 10 for our y. And now for our text, we're going to do score. We'll do score colon and then space. Now for our text styling, let's do our font size. And let's do 16 pixels. Finally, for our game object, we want our text to be displayed on top of everything else in our game. So we're going to use the set depth property to make sure it's displayed above everything else. So we'll set our text game object to be 2. So now if we save and come over to our game, we should see our new text game object added in our top left-hand corner. So now we have our score prefix. Now we need to create a game object for our actual score. So for this, we'll use our score text property. We'll set it equal to, I'm going to copy this block of code. We'll paste it. Now for our x value, we're going to want this to be based on our text game object that we added for our prefix. So we'll reference our score text prefix. We'll grab our x value, and now we want to add in our display width. That way our score value isn't on top of that text game object. So if we do our score text prefix, then we'll do our display width. So now for our y value, let's do our score text prefix game object, and we'll grab our y value. Now for our text, we'll set this to be 0. So now we'll keep the same font styling and our depth. We save and come back to our game, we should see our score now displays 0. So now that we have our text game object, we just need to update it when our score increases. So if we come down to our handle bullet and enemy collision method, let's remove our console log before we update our score. Now we can do this. We'll reference our score text game object. Now we want to call set text. And now we can pass in our score value as a string. So do this.score. Now we'll do toString, and then we'll pass in 10. Now if we save and come back to our game, let's try destroying one of our asteroids. And we'll see our score starts updating as we destroy our enemies. Nice. Next, we'll add a visual indicator for the Earth's health. You can do this as a row of heart icons, a health bar, or even a number. For now, we'll keep it simple. We'll display 3 heart images below our planet and remove one each time our planet takes damage. For the hearts we'll display for our planet, we'll need to create a sprite game object. That way we can use our animation that's tied to our heart here. To make it a little bit easier to work with our heart game objects, we're going to create a phaser container game object. A container, as the name implies, is a game object that can contain other types of game objects. And so what's really nice about our container game objects is when we place our game objects inside our container, their positions are calculated based on where our container is at in our game. This makes it really easy to position groups of game objects together in our scene. So to keep track of our container game object, let's add a new property to our class. We're going to call this Planet Health Container. And so now to create our game object, let's come down to our create method. After we set our planet's health, we'll do this. We're going to do our Planet Health Container, set equal to this.add.container. And now for our game object, we want to position this just below our planet. So for our x value, we'll do this. Our scale, our width, we'll divide it by 2. And now we're going to grab our planet's position, and we'll grab our y value, and we'll add 50 to it. And then for our third argument, we can pass an array of game objects that we want to add inside our container. And so for these objects, these will be our heart game objects we want to create. So let's do this.add.sprite. So now for our x and y position, we'll do 0, 0. And now for our asset, we want to do our asset keys. We want to do our heart. Since this is a sprite sheet, we'll pass 0 for our first frame. And now we want to call our play method. We want to do our asset keys and then our heart. So now if we save and come back over to our game, we should now see our new heart game object position below our planet. So now we have our first heart game object. We just need to add 2 more to represent our full health. For that, I'm going to copy this line of code. We'll paste it twice. So now for our first hard game object, we want this to be left of our current position. We'll do -18 for our X. And then for our third game object, we want this to be on the right-hand side, so we'll do 18. And now if we save and we come back to our game, we now have our 3 hard game objects. Finally, for our hard game objects, as our planet takes damage, we'll want to remove that game object from our scene. To make this change, we'll want to come down to our logic where we update our planet's health. Let's remove our console log, and now we'll want to destroy one of our game objects. So we'll need to reference our planet health container, and now we want to use the getAt method. And so what the getAt method allows us to do is we can grab one of our child game objects from our container based on its index. And so when we create our 3 heart game objects and add them to our container, our first heart will have an index of 0, our next one will have an index of 1, and then our last one will have an index of 2. And so based on that index, we can pass that value here to get that game object. And so for this value, we're going to use our planet health property on our class. How this will work is when our game starts, our health will be set to 3. Once we take damage, we're going to decrement this to be 2. And when we do that, when we go to grab our game object, that's going to allow us to grab our third game object we added to our container. Once we take our next point of damage, it'll drop down to 1, which will allow us to grab our middle game object. And when we take our final point of damage, it's going to drop to 0, which will allow us to grab our first game object. So once we have our game object, now we can call the destroy method to remove it from our game. We come back to our game. If we let one of our asteroids collide with our planet, we should see our heart game object disappear. And now each time we take damage, one of our heart game objects is removed from our game. For our next bit of polish, we're going to work on adding some transitions when we transition between our phaser scenes. Currently, when we go from our game scene to our game over scene, the transition is very abrupt, where we just stop our existing scene and then immediately show our game over scene. For our transition, we'll have our scene fade to black, and then we'll have a nice fade in effect on the scene that we're starting. To do this, we can use some of the built-in methods on our phaser camera. So in our damage planet method, instead of transitioning right to our game over scene, we'll want to do our fade out effect. To create this effect, we can do this. We'll do cameras to reference our cameras manager. We'll do main to reference our main camera. And now we'll do our fade out method. Our fade out method allows us to specify how long we want this camera effect to last for and what color we want to fade to. By default, all of these arguments are optional. And so for our fade effect, it would be 1 second or 1000 milliseconds. For our game, this is a little bit long, so we're going to set this value to be 500. Now for our color, we can specify our red, green, and blue values, and that will determine the color that we'll fade to. By default, if we emit those, we'll fade to the color black. Now that we're triggering our fade out effect, we need to wait until this is completed before we start our next scene. We can listen for our built-in events in phaser for when our fade out is completed. To listen for this event, we're going to do this.cameras.main, and now we're going to use the once method. The once method allows us to register a one-time event listener for a given event by its name. For the event we want to listen for, this is going to be our phaser, our cameras, our scene 2D, then our events, and now we want to do our fade out complete event. And so now when this event is fired, now we can provide the callback that we want to invoke. Now in the callback function here, this is where we want to start our game over scene. Now if we save and come back to our game, now if we have our planet take enough damage, we should now see our nice fade out effect. So now, once we start our game over scene, our scene immediately flashes on our screen. For us to complete our transition, we're going to do a fade in effect when our game over scene starts. To do this, we'll come into our game over class, and our create method at the bottom. Let's do this, we'll do our cameras, we'll do our main camera, and now we want to do our fade in effect. For our fade in effect, this is very similar to fade out, where we can specify our duration, and then what color we want to fade in from. We'll stick with our default color of black. Now if we save and come back to our game, let's have our planet take some damage. Once we take 3 points of damage, we'll fade out to our game over scene, and then we'll fade in once our scene starts. So now we'll want to do the same thing from our game over scene to our game scene. So if we come back to our code, let's jump over to our game scene. Let's come down to the bottom. Let's copy our code for our camera transition. We'll come to our logic where we start our game scene. Let's paste in that code. Now let's take our line of code where we start our game scene, and we're going to replace that and then we'll paste it down here in our event handler for our fade out complete event. Next, let's copy our line of code for our fade in. We'll come to our game scene. Let's go to the bottom of our create method. Let's paste in that line of code. We'll save. Now when our game starts, we have a nice fade in effect. And now if we take damage, we should fade out and go to our game over scene. And now when we click, we have our fade out effect, and then we fade in to our game scene. Nice. For our next round of polish, we're going to add some sound effects and background music to our game. So in our assets folder, under audio, we have some background music and sound effects we want to add to our game. Our Space Asteroids file here will be our background music, and then we have some sound effects that will play once one of our asteroids is destroyed and when we fire our weapon in our game. For our background music, we'll want this to play throughout our whole game. A good spot to do this will be in our preload scene in our create method after we've loaded in all of our assets. So in Phaser, our sound manager, this is one of our global services in our game. What this means is our sound manager, this is shared by all of our scenes in our game. Due to this, we can play our background music in one scene, and once we transition to our next scene, our background music will continue to play. And so if we want to play our background music, we can do this to reference our phaser scene. We'll do sound to reference our sound manager. And now we want to do the play method to play our audio file. So now in our play method, our first argument is going to be the key of the audio file that we loaded in Phaser. For this, we'll want to reference our asset keys. So if we come up to our import, let's add in our asset keys. Now back down in our play method, we'll do asset keys. And now we want to reference our background music. For our second argument, this is an optional object that allows us to provide settings that we want to apply to the sound that we're playing. And so for our settings, this can include things like our loop property. And so if we want our music to loop in our game, for our background music, we want this to be true. We can also modify the volume that our audio file will play at. And so for this property, this should be a value between 0 and 1, where 0 would be our sound won't be audible at all, and 1 would be the default volume of that audio file. So now if we save and come back to our game, once our game starts, we should now hear our background music playing. So even though we transition from our preload scene to our game scene, we can still hear our background music. Once we transition to our game over scene, we should still hear our background music playing. Now that we have our background music working for our game, let's add in the rest of our sound effects. So let's copy our block of code where we play our background music. We'll come to our game scene. First, we'll add in our sound effect for when we fire one of our bullets. So if we come down to our fire bullet method, before we do our console log, we'll paste in our code. And now for our sound effect, we want to do our asset keys. And now we'll do our FX shot. Now for our sound effect, we don't want this to loop. We only want to play it one time. So let's remove our loop property. By default, that property is set to false. Now for our volume, we don't want this to be as loud as our background music, so we're going to do 0.1. So let's copy that block of code. Next, we'll add in our sound effect for whenever asteroids is destroyed. So if we come down to our method where we spawn our destroyed enemy, at the bottom of our method, we'll paste in our code. Now for our sound effect, we want to do our FX, and we want to do our explosion. Now for the sound effect, we'll do 0.5. Finally, we want to play a sound effect once our planet takes damage. So if we come down to our damage planet method, after we do our tween animation, we'll paste in our code. Now for our sound effect, we want to do our FX, and then our hit. For our volume, let's do 0.4. Now if we save, we can go back to our game test. So now when we fire our bullets, and we destroy our asteroids, and when one of our asteroids collides with our planet, we should hear our various sound effects. Now, for our final bit of polish. For our game, we're going to create a new title screen that will display when our player first launches our game. On our title screen, we'll display the name of our game, as well as the text click to play so our player can start our game. To add our new screen, we'll need to create a new phaser scene. So under our scenes folder, let's make a new file. We're going to call this titlescene.js. Let's go into our game over scene class. Let's copy all of our code. We'll paste that into our title scene. Let's update our class name. We'll do title scene. Let's remove our score property. Now our constructor, let's do our scene keys. And now we want to do our title scene. We'll remove our init method. So now our create method, first we'll create our background. So now for our text game objects, instead of displaying game over, we'll display planet defense. We'll keep our same X and Y value and the same styling for our game object. Next, let's get rid of our game object tied to our player score. And now for our text, let's do click to play. We'll keep the same position and same styling, and now we'll want our player to click on our screen to transition to our game scene. Finally, for our title screen, let's add our planet that our player will need to defend. So let's do this.add.sprite. Now for our X position, we want this to be in the center of our screen. We'll do this.scale.width. We'll divide it by 2. For Y, let's do this.scale.height. We'll divide it by 2. For asset keys, let's do our planet. We'll do 0 for our frame. Now let's play our animation to have our planet spin. So we'll do our asset keys, and let's do our planet. So now that we have our new scene, we need to update our game configuration. So if we go into main.js, first we'll want to import our scene. I'm going to copy this line of code, we'll paste it. Let's do title scene, and now we'll import that from our scenes, and then title-scene.js. At the bottom of our class, let's copy one of our lines of code for adding our scene. We'll do our scene keys. Let's do our title scene. And now we'll do our title scene class. Finally, let's go into our preload scene class. Instead of transitioning to our game scene, we want to transition to our title scene. So now if we save, let's come back to our game. When our scene starts, we should have our nice fade in effect, and we should see our new phaser scene. So now if we click to play our game, our scene should fade out, and we transition to our game scene. Nice. That's it. We now have a fully working game with core mechanics, enemies, difficulty scaling, score tracking, and UI polish. In the final video, we'll do a quick recap of everything we built and wrap up the course. See you there.